So when I think of roses, I tend to think of reds, whites, and pinks, but never purple. So let's take a look at this interesting purple ink from Monteverde. So it's been just over a year since the last time we took a look at a Monteverde ink, and at that time it was Copper Noir, which, come to think of it, ended up being a personal favorite and a good penabling ink for my older brother. This time around, we're sticking with Noir and seeing if this purple ink is going to end up sticking around. Now, I've looked at some pretty good purples from Waterman and Pelican, but something about them just left me wanting more. I don't know if it was the dynamic range or the choice in sheening profiles, but something about them just felt off. So before we take a look at Rose Noir, let's go ahead and do a quick rundown. On the positives, and kind of in true Monteverde form, the ink is well lubricated. The purple is actually a nice shade on both Tomoe and Rhodia, and it's pretty consistent on both papers. The dry times do seem a little slow, but my calibration there could be off from some of the other inks that I've reviewed recently. Also, water performance is where I would expect from one of the Noir inks, but this one kind of has a little bit of a twist. As for what could be better, I'd honestly want to see a little bit more dynamic range from this ink, and maybe I'm a bit weird here, but this feels more like a Lavender Noir more than anything else. So now that we've got the TLDR out of the way, let's get to the ink. As far as packaging goes, there isn't much here on this 30ml bottle, and that's not a downside. Inside the plastic hanger box are the retail markers for sales purposes, the ink name, and a color reference. The only thing that's missing on this bottle is the plastic cap seal that I took off before the review, but we all know what those look like. And as for the bottle itself, I've got to admit that I'm a fan of simplicity. For these smaller bottles from Monteverde, you get a nice glass bottle with a metal cap, and the opening is wide enough that you don't have to worry about what pen you're filling. Now, there are a couple of downsides here, like glass being easier to break for some people than plastic bottles, and no nib divot at the bottom for better filling when the bottle runs low, but at a price point of $10 for 30ml, you get a pretty good value. And that's going to be it for the bottle. So let's take a look at the ink blot. So starting with the lighter shades, this is a little more along the lines of what I think would pass for rose, but it's kind of still more on that purple side. It's a nice light shade though, and if you have a drier nib or write quickly, this could be a nice color for journaling ink. But on the right is what I'm expecting most of us would see on a regular basis. And this is kind of where the ink loses the whole rose moniker for me. The midtones come off plum at best, and there isn't much in the way of dynamic range here, as the tipping point from plum to black with green sheen is pretty immediate, and at least with the nibs I've used this ink in, you really spend most of your time on this threshold, which also kind of creates a missed opportunity if you ask me. This ink though is actually a pleasure to write with. Like the other inks from Yafa that I've tried, it's well behaved, and in my T1, I'm having no flow issues and no issues with hard starting or skipping for that matter. I don't know what their ITF technology is, but it's apparently working, because I made it at least 10 minutes with the pen uncapped, and it started right back up with no issues. Now back to the Rhodia sample, you can see what I was saying about the dynamic range. On some of the quicker parts, we catch a glimpse of the lavender hues, but for the most part, I'm constantly hovering on those transitional dark plum tones. And out of a fine nib, I'm coming close to getting the sheen as I'm writing, but unfortunately, you are going to need a wider or wetter nib if that is the end goal. And that definitely carries over to the Tomoe sample as well. I actually prefer this ink on Tomoe, which is a good thing because TR happens to be my paper of choice. I think what makes this combination for me is how the ink feels like it's popping off the page. Well, that and how we're getting more of the dynamic range. Unlike on Rhodia though, where even from a fine nib we started closer to the sheen threshold, on TR it's starting closer to the midtones and occasionally fading over into the deeper plum hues. And, much like on Rhodia, the flow on TR is right on point, giving me no problems whatsoever from a fine nib. And like I was saying earlier, the dry time is consistent across both papers, and looking at Rhodia, we're functionally dry around 15 seconds, and the same can be said for Tomoe. Now, I would have preferred a little bit of a quicker dry time at around 10 seconds, but this isn't bad. And to pull off a consistent dry time on both papers under 20 seconds is actually a pretty good showing. And that brings us around to this last test. In this case, Noir really doesn't give an indication about water performance, and it's more of a descriptor for the overall shade of the ink. Also, these are not pigmented inks in any form, so I was honestly not expecting much here in the way of water resistance. But overall, this isn't that bad. What is left is definitely pink, which for some reason was completely unexpected for me. And maybe I guess I'm just used to the ghosting layers being some type of gray or purple like Rome Burning. But what is left is enough for me to say that this is a water-resistant ink. And with that, we're going to wrap up the review of Monteverde Rose Noir. Check out my other ink reviews and suggest inks that you would like to see on the channel in the comments below. And while you're down there, consider subscribing if you haven't, and check out the Patreon link in the show notes if you want to support the channel. But till next time, don't drink the ink.